We'll start officially. Recording. So my name is Anthony Reddy, and I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. This is the fourth in our series looking at freedom of religion and belief, and our speaker this evening is in effect one of our own. Dr. Sean Oliver Dee is a research associate within the Regent's Park College within the OCRC. And we are pleased to have him speak this evening. His topic is Protestantism, Progressivism, Religious Freedom and the British Empire, Religious Freedom in the British Colonial Period. And after some teething difficulties, and I know that you did have a PowerPoint that sadly we will not get to see.
No problem.
Sean, we are in your hands.
Thank you. This paper is really the follow-up to a paper I presented for the senior seminar back in November 2018, which focused on definitions of religious freedom in British imperial policy-making circles, as defined in Queen Victoria's 1858 proclamation of religious freedom when she became Empress of India. The focus of that paper was on the sort of outworkings of that in the context of Asia and the MENA region. In that paper, I used studies from India, the Arabian Peninsula, and also Ottoman Turkey to argue that the fundamental conception of religious freedom contained in the 1858 proclamation was based upon a different framework of religious freedom to that which developed in the post-Second World War era by the newly formed transnational institutions. I noted that whereas the post-war definition of religious freedom formed on the basis of freedom of conscience, that the 1858 proclamation's definition of religious freedom was based on the idea of religious freedom as freedom from proselytizing, specifically Christian missions to Hindus and Muslims. And as part of that presentation, I noted the work in correspondence around Dr. Kohl in Ottoman Turkey in 1879, who was imprisoned for the distribution of Christian leaflets and proselytizing within Ottoman Turkey. And also the attempt by Mr. and Mrs. Miller, an American couple, to enter the Hijaz region in 1922 for the purposes of proselytizing, as well as the complaint by Maharaja Ranbir Singh, who was complaining about the creation of a Christian medical hospital in his region, which he argued would be used for missions. In all of these responses, the British officials argued that their refusal, for example, to allow the Millers into Hijaz was on the basis of what we might term today social cohesion issues. That the activities of Kohl in Ottoman Turkey and the example of the Christian medical hospital were all occasions in which British officials actively dissuaded, even prevented proselytizing by Christian missionaries in the sensitive areas. And this all related back to the claim which was, or the commitment which was made in paragraph 8 of the 1858 declaration, which committed the British authorities to, quote, disclaim the right and desire to impose our convictions on any of our subjects. The proclamation was a clear response to the events which had brought British India under the direct British government rule, rather than under the rule of the British East India Company, as had been the case to that point. For it was the rebellion, or First War of Independence, as it's known in India, of 1857-58 that had ended company rule. A rebellion which was believed by the British to have been planned and executed by Muslim rulers, but whose long-term causes could be found in the Hindu and Muslim alarm at the impact of the vigorous proselytizing work of British and other missionaries, along with British education. In this paper, I wish to widen the lens to look at the intellectual and cultural shaping of British conceptions of religious freedom, specifically the perceived connection between religious freedom, Protestantism, and Progressivism. At the outset, I'd like to highlight that my argument will not be theological. I do not have the knowledge for that, but rather my argument will be historical and cultural. The perceived connection in British identity between Protestantism, Progressivism, and religious freedom is the core of what I'm investigating. And in order to investigate that claim, I will use case studies from Canada and Russia. Specifically, the work of the first British governor of Canada, James Murray, and British humanitarian work in late imperial and early Bolshevik Russia. These two case studies have been chosen because the first one provides a new view on religious freedom, questions from an earlier period of the British Empire, almost a century before the 1858 proclamation. The other, on humanitarian responses in Russia, deliberately steps outside of the corridors of imperial power to examine and explore whether the same connections between Protestantism, Progressivism, and religious freedom were prevalent within wider British society, as they were perhaps implicitly within the corridors of Whitehall and the imperial domains. My core question will be, to what extent can British imperial definitions of religious freedom be understood as a product of the cultural assumption of a connection between Protestantism and progress? In responding to this question, I'll be engaging principally with the argument of Peter Miller in his book, Defining the Common Good, Empire, Religion, and Philosophy in the 18th Century Britain. But I shall also discuss the argument of Sadia Saeed in her article, Imperial Ideologies, Transnational Activism, questioning the place of religious freedom in British India, as my paper links back to the 1858 Proclamation of Religious Freedom. I propose that Miller's argument is vital for establishing an evidence base for the pervasiveness of Protestant progressive link in the psyche of 18th and 19th century Britons. So Peter Miller, in his book, Defining the Common Good, examines the place of Protestantism in the creation of the identity and morals of 18th and 19th century Britain. Britain's approach to the centrality of Protestantism in English and wider British identity in relation to other factors, particularly the impact of the Enlightenment, makes it a particularly valuable comparative study in the context of the questions this paper is seeking to answer. He notes that the definitions of common good that had been embedded in England since the 16th century were substantially rearranged in the light of the perception that it no longer served the needs of a society in which the individual's relationship to the community was becoming the central issue. For Miller, it was, quote, the crisis of relations with the North American colonies and the renewed demand for wider religious toleration at home, which struck at the theoretical foundations of that type of state, close quote. The identity of the state had been coupled closely to its religious orientation during the 16th century, Miller argues. But by the time of the late 18th century, the connection between state and faith had been substantially undermined by the dissatisfaction of the American colonies, who were also Protestant. It was into this North Atlantic milieu that the Enlightenment brought a new narrative in which identity of the state was more closely tied to the individual. Yet Miller does not contend that the place of religion in statecraft and state identity was pushed out in the late 18th century, nor does he argue for a modernist privatization of religion framework, in which religion becomes less relevant in a national and international context, which the maneuvering of states rather than monarchs becomes the central focus of international affairs. Instead, he argues that it is the continuing influence of the work of Cicero in statecraft, and in particular, Cicero's conception of the value of religion in defining the common good, which was the key factor in the shaping of the place of religion in national and international affairs throughout this period. For evidence, Miller notes Cicero's De Officiis, and its arguments concerning the essential ingredients for the maintenance of the common good. That it was second only in popularity to the Bible in terms of sales. Amongst those ingredients, the notion of the mos maiorum, the support for the religion of the state and its ancient customs, was a key feature. Miller asserts that three key features bound the state and faith in identity. Firstly, the maintenance of a given confession was deemed in the interest of the state. Secondly, many of the states themselves were composites of smaller polities, and therefore religious uniformity glued otherwise disparate entities together, creating a single centralized entity coincided with the Ciceronian concept of the good and the useful. The creation of a unified polity between the common conceptions of the good. Third, that the community identity was a key tool to be utilized by the statesman. So the common good, whether Protestant or Catholic, was therefore focused around community. For some, the shape of that community was determined by religious beliefs. For others, particularly Montaigne, the presence of the community itself was the key importance rather than any ideological agreement. Yet the uncertain nature of community remained a constant threat to the legitimacy of states. Robert Evans cites the Habsburg Empire as a case study of the struggle to create community from disparate ethnicities, religions, affiliations, and cultures. These tensions pushed the development of both centralization around a monarchy or republic with common sets of ideas and symbols, resulting in some form of social contract. In this context, Miller argues that the North American colonial rebellion could be characterized as a religious war, in which the colonialists sought to enforce a feeling of community which was already evaporating. Whether we agree with this specific assessment about the American War of Independence or not, Miller's argument about the centrality of the creation of community and its historical attachment to religious identity, flowing from the echoes of Reformation politics, has value in underpinning British identity in the 19th century. Miller's argument buttresses Linda Coley's argument in her important book, Britain's The Forging of a Nation, in which she argues that the concept of Britain, quote unquote, only really came into existence as a conscious entity in the Napoleonic Wars, both through the confluence of men in the huge armies drawn from all over the country, as well as the othering of the French as the common enemy. Whether it was different regions of England, or whether it be troops from Scotland and Wales, as well as to a lesser extent, then United Ireland, the common bonds outside of language within the regiments was Protestantism. That Protestantism and the wealth generated by that nation of shopkeepers in Bonaparte's famous put down was core to Britishness. There can be little doubt that Miller's argument about the centrality of Protestantism in British identity in the 19th century, even with the shifting intellectual currents of the mid to late part of that century, appears uncontestable. Linda Coley's thesis about the forging of a British identity provides a robust underpinning to Miller's argument, coming, as she does, from a different conceptual framework. Miller's broad cultural analysis of the Protestant underpinnings of British identity is helpful in understanding the cultural perceptions, albeit shifting over time, which were then exported through the empire, underpinning, amongst a host of other applications, especially in education, religious freedom. In this context, Saadia Saeed's analysis provides a helpful non-British perspective on the outworkings of British conceptions of religious freedom. The focus of her argument is upon how British engaged with religious freedom issues surrounding the nascent Ahmadiyya community. Saeed's choice of the Ahmadiyya for her analysis is interesting in and of itself, for as she notes, the Ahmadiyya, quote, the Ahmadiyya movement's extensive engagement with the British make them as strikingly distinct from other Muslim travelers from British India, close quote. The general rule amongst Muslims in British India, whether staying in India or traveling in other parts of the empire for Hajj, for example, was to engage with the British imperial administration as little as possible. But right from its earliest years, the Ahmadiyya saw in British rule a power which could be utilized to protect them from Orthodox Muslims. For that reason, the Ahmadiyya courted British officials as a matter of course, seeking the protection of British colonial administration. Saeed helpfully observes that the British authorities were not always willing to side with the Ahmadiyya, especially if it meant upholding Ahmadiyya protections against Orthodox Muslim claims. For, as I've noted previously, British imperial policy placed Muslim concerns at the heart of its security and cohesion policies. The combination of the large imperial Muslim population, a number of rebellions and uprisings, which rightly or wrongly were blamed upon Muslim leadership, and the need to maintain good relations with the Ottomans to prevent Russian expansion and secure the Suez Canal, along with the growing pan-Islamic agitation, made good relations with Muslims a key policy issue on multiple fronts. Said's article, when dovetailed with Miller's contextual observations, therefore helpfully highlight what will be an important theme, and in many ways a caveat to my 2018 paper about the conception of religious freedom in British policymaking as a freedom from proselytizing. Namely, that religious freedom policy was ultimately governed by pragmatism born of localized needs, but that the wider construct of British religious freedom was also underpinned by the assumed link between Protestantism and societal progress. But can this Protestant identity be said to have a causal relationship with the conceptions of religious freedom that were at the heart of the Proclamation of 1858? In order to answer that question, we need to acknowledge the shift in evangelical thinking about empire that took place in the 19th century. Andrew Porter's chapter, Atonement, Sin and Empire, in Imperial Horizons of British Protestant Missions, Bebbington's article within Porter's book, utilized the leading evangelical periodicals of the time, the Record and the Christian World, to demonstrate that urban evangelicals in Britain, particularly nonconformists, increasingly argued that the expansion of British imperial rule was a powerful force for remedying the wrongs of the world. In other words, they believed that empire could serve as a powerful weapon against sin itself. This was a contrast to earlier generations, Bebbington argued, who worried greatly about the evils that accompanied imperial expansion, as well as railing against the immorality of colonial frontiers. For evangelicals in the later 19th century, the British Empire was a vehicle that would enable Protestantism to flourish, whilst at the same time, it could also be a mantle which would protect against the indigenous peoples from false religions, such as Islam, and particularly Roman Catholicism. Bebbington's convincing argument is important in helping us to understand the internal British religio-cultural issues which fed into the 1858 Proclamation of Religious Freedom, for it highlights the opportunities which Protestant missionaries saw in the Pax Britannica, whilst at the same time, from the imperial administration point of perspective, understanding the context in which such a proclamation might become necessary for the sake of imperial peace and cohesion. Moreover, in a wider context of the link between Protestant and progress, Bebbington's work is valuable in evidencing this underlying assumption. For it is this assumption which is the constant thread which ties together the differing approaches to religious freedom which are found between the British public and the policymakers in Victorian and pre-First World War Britain. So, having established the intellectual and religious cultural context of my argument, what evidence for the link between Protestantism and progressivism in the practice of religious freedom can be found in British imperial actions? As I mentioned, my previous paper about religious freedom in the British Empire focused upon incidents in the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. But for this paper, I wanted to expand the scope of that engagement with Miller and Said by discussing two case studies from different parts of the world entirely. The purpose of using these two case studies is to explore the applicability of what I have labeled the freedom from proselytization thesis, in the context of the 1858 proclamation in different global regions, one within and one without the British Empire, but both involving British officials, organizations, and members of the public. The first case study comes from the early years of the British Empire in the work of James Murray, who was the first British governor of the newly conquered former French colony of Quebec. Murray's religious freedom became encapsulated in the 1774 Quebec Act, and as such provides an important focus for this discussion in the context of the overall argument about the definition of religious freedom under British imperial rule in the late 19th century. Paul, unlike the second case study on Russia, which concerns non-governmental humanitarian work, Murray is acting, or was acting, on behalf of the British imperial apparatus. The nature of Murray's conception of religious freedom therefore offers a window into understandings of religious freedom which predate the 1858 proclamation, and in so doing, offer some caveats to my assertion about the definition of religious freedom in the British Empire. As Lawrence Uzel notes in his article about Murray, the British conquest of Quebec could quite easily have turned into a case of Protestant authority oppressing a largely Catholic population. Murray, as the first British governor of Quebec and the representative of a state which, as we noted earlier, remained strongly identified with its Protestantism, could quite easily have chosen a path of intolerance and anti-Roman Catholic oppression under his administration. After all, as Colin Hayden documents, back in England, Catholics were still subject to discrimination, even more than a century after the end of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation wars. Indeed, the blueprint for Murray's work could have been Ireland, for if England was discriminatory of Catholics, in Ireland over the course of the 18th century, it became harder rather than easier for Irish Catholics to vote in elections, serve in juries, work as a lawyer, or to serve in the military. So the fact that Murray chose an alternative path is all the more fascinating, as it appears to run cultural to the prevailing political culture of the time. However, rather than arguing that Murray's policies of religious tolerance were politically countercultural, it would perhaps be more accurate to argue that Murray's policies are more indicative of a wider shift in British political culture in the realm of religious freedom. For there are strong indications that the tolerant policies towards Quebecian Catholics predated Murray's arrival. Indeed, it went right back to the earliest moments of the British conquest of Quebec. For under the very Articles of Capitulation signed in Montreal in 1760, the victorious British general Geoffrey Amherst accepted that the Catholic clergy and Catholic parishioners were allowed to continue to worship and receive the sacrament. However, unsurprisingly, the right of the French monarch to choose the Bishop of Quebec was ended. Amherst himself postponed any decisions on the financing of Catholic seminaries in Quebec, along with the Catholic-run hospitals. They had been receiving substantial subsidies from France, which the British had no interest in allowing to continue. But the question then became whether the seminaries would effectively be strangled to death by ending their source of funding and not permitting any new sources of funding to be developed. It was with the signing of the formal Treaty of Quebec in 1763 and the arrival of James Murray the year before as its first governor that these questions were resolved. Murray provided subsidies for the nuns who ran the hospitals and permitted the Catholic parish priests to be paid by the British Crown. Moreover, he did not actively promote Protestantism in Quebec, allowing Catholic schools to continue to educate the majority of children and Catholic priests to carry out their work unmolested. Yet it would be wrong to think of Murray's religious freedom as springing from a sectarian blind standpoint. Peter Doll, in his book Revolution, Religion and National Identity, Imperial Anglicanism in British North America, notes that Murray suggested one French Huguenot Protestant priest might be introduced into the province on the basis that once the local Catholic populations were confronted with the, quote, good sense of the Protestant priest, close quote, then conversions amongst the Francophone Quebecois would inevitably result. It's important, therefore, to observe that Murray's actions should not be seen through the lens of the Enlightenment, or even postmodern thinking. Murray did not have religious syncretic leanings in any form. He was a Protestant and, as he displayed in his personal views, saw a natural connection between Protestantism and progressive thinking. His policies of religious freedom were therefore not about his personal convictions, but about how to ensure peace within the territories that he was responsible for. In that context, he very much echoed the conception of religious freedom which was proclaimed by Queen Victoria in 1858. The difference with Murray's conception was that rather than being about freedom from proselytizing, as was deemed necessary for India and the Middle East, the conception of religious freedom that Murray was enacting was about managing and controlling an established religious tradition in order to smooth the transition of power. Despite the gap of a century between Murray's work and the 1858 proclamation, therefore, this case study demonstrates that although there was a very clear accent on pragmatism in the formation of British definitions of religious freedom, driven largely by local contexts and traditions, that they remained both before and after the proclamation, or they were enforced both before and after the proclamation. In the broader context of the time, one could argue that Murray's actions in Quebec could therefore be seen as indicative of the changing political culture. For despite the fact that the policies towards Catholics in England, and even more so in Ireland, being still discriminatory, even oppressive in the case of Ireland, that the relative distance, both in time from the Reformation and geography, meant that Murray was able to drive policies towards Catholics which were not yet culturally possible back in the British Isles. Quebec did not have the same historical baggage which Ireland especially carried. These factors therefore allowed Murray much more flexibility to embed religious freedom into the constitutional apparatus in a way that it would not, which would have been far more resisted if such policies were advocated for in England and Ireland, even given the changing political culture. Thus far, the focus has been on religious freedom as conceived within the state apparatus of the British Empire. But for the second case study, I'll turn instead to a study which is outside of the imperial apparatus, to see whether the Protestant progressive yet pragmatic conceptions of religious freedom developed in policy-making circles were reflected in wider British society in the imperial period. This will provide further insights in conceptions of religious freedom during this period, providing the basis to draw some conclusions about the nature of religious freedom, in the context of which Miller and Said's perceptions can be discussed. So the second case study is focused upon British philanthropic and missionary activity in Tsarist Russia. In his book, British Humanitarian Activity in Russia, 1890 to 1923, Luke Kelly provides a wide-angle lens on the types and scopes of British aid and missional activity in late imperial and early Bolshevik Russia. He highlights the work of British individuals and organizations in responding to the Russian famine of 1891-92, as well as in the famine of 1921 to 23. These humanitarian and relief responsibilities form the bookends within which the range of relief, development, and missional activity are analyzed. In his introduction, after highlighting the gifts given by the British public in response to Indian famines, which amounted to the equivalent of hundreds of millions of pounds in today's money, Kelly notes that, quote, by the 1890s, giving aid for distant strangers had become an established part of British life. Russia became an object of interventions as British churches, journalists, and politicians, amongst others, presented an assortment of humanitarian prescriptions to a country seen to be struggling. The Society of Friends, the Quakers, offered famine relief in 1891-92, the 1907 famine, and in 1921-23, war relief from 1916, as well as providing support to the persecuted Dukhubar sect after 1897. Russia's persecution of Jews prompted condemnation throughout the period. Many groups, including the newly formed Save the Children's Fund, sent money and workers to help in the 1921-23 famine as part of an internationalized effort. So the range and scope of this, the range and scope of this humanitarian response in Russia was mirrored not just in Russia and India, but also in the Middle East and Eastern Europe as well. And for Kelly, this was a direct result of the close cooperation between liberals and Christians in the Victorian era. And yet the motivations for this humanitarian effort varied widely. And furthermore, that, quote, the humanitarian attention given to Russia between 1890 and 1923 was the result of a specific conjuncture of ideas and actors, rather than the simple application of humanitarian ideal, close quote. What made British philanthropic activity in Russia distinct, according to Kelly, was that it was not the fact of the suffering itself that was a primary generator of the enterprise, but rather it was the perspectives, interests, and techniques of the actors concerned that was of importance. The appeal of Russia at this time was motivated by multiple different actors. Sometimes it was the transnational networks established through Russian exiles, or it might be, it could be Lev Tolstoy, who rallied interest in the plight of the Russian peasant. It might also be the Quakers, who were heavily involved in Russian relief and religious freedom work, who saw Russian dissenters as an aspect of their own religious mission. It is within this wider context that Kelly devotes one chapter to British humanitarian efforts in Russia in relation to religious freedom. In the opening of that chapter, he makes the following bold assertion, quote, "For many Britons, Protestantism went hand in hand with progress. Russia was backward in part because its state religion repressed the energies of its people, both within and without the Orthodox communion." British Protestants took the fact that some Russian peasant sects dissented from the state church as a signal that societal progress in Russia was being stifled. In that context, therefore, advocacy and activism on behalf of religious freedom in Russia was not simply a common good in and of itself, but was also seen as providing a service to wider Russian society, because the encouragement of religious freedom meant also, by extension, the modernization or progress of Russian society. Yet, if it was the nonconformist peasants who were the initial trigger for religious freedom advocacy in this context, as Andrew Thompson in his chapter in Trim and Simmons highlights, it was the plight of Russian Jews that stimulated what became the long-standing theme of international humanitarian, or a long-standing theme of international humanitarian work, solidarity between Protestants and Jews, along with the protection of Christians abroad. Critiques of Tsarist autocracy in British Protestant and liberal circles clustered around religious oppression. One of the key moments in stimulating advocacy for religious freedom occurred in 1895, when the Dokhubors, a Christian sect in the Caucasus, burned their weapons in protest at conscription and were flogged for their actions. An international campaign led by Lev Tolstoy, along with British Quakers, brought their suffering to the attention of the world and raised funds for the Dokhubors' relocation. Other sects, such as the Baptists and Mennonites, attracted the attention and aid of British church groups and the press. But it was the suffering of Russian Jews, particularly in the high-profile events such as the Kishinev pogrom, that raised indignation and rallied support for British Jewish suffering for British audiences. This religiously framed suffering drove religious groups to offer solidarity and aid. This interest is indicative not just of the mixing of religious concerns with humanitarian methods, but of the central role that religious freedom played as a concept in establishing a link for British Protestants between freedom, Protestantism, and social progress. So what, as we draw to a close, what counters or caveats to my previous paper on religious freedom in the British Empire do these case studies offer in the context of the arguments of Miller and Said? Returning to the question I posed at the outset, which is, to what extent can British imperial definitions of religious freedom be understood as a product of the British cultural assumption of the connection between Protestantism and progress? I would argue that the case studies in this paper suggest more of a caveat than a counter to my previous paper, for they provide evidence that, whilst the British government itself defined religious freedom for political purposes as the freedom from proselytizing, particularly in its imperial domains, that both inside and outside the corridors of power, religious freedom was understood as intertwined both with Protestantism and with wider societal progress. In his book, Empire, the British Imperial Experience from 1765 to the present, the British historian Dennis Judd makes the following comment about Christianity in the British Empire. Quote, although the British did not, in general, propagate the Christian faith with the zeal and ruthlessness of, say, the Spanish conquistadors in Latin America, their insistence on the benevolence, justice, and evolutionary potential of British imperial rule was, in effect, an alternative religion. Judd's contention, therefore, is that it was British understanding of democracy and their broader perception of the superiority of the civilization being offered by British governance that was of paramount importance, rather than the promulgation of Christianity per se. The fact that British civilization was not wholly divisible from Protestant Christianity was tacitly acknowledged, although not embraced by all. However, from the evidence offered by Miller and underlined in both the case studies as well as in the work of Regent, Judd's perspective would appear to miss the foundational importance of the ubiquitous connection between Protestantism and Progressivism, which pervaded both policymaking culture and the general public. The difference between the perceptions of religious freedom found within policy-making circles and those found amongst the general public in Britain were based upon the perceived connection between Protestantism and societal progress. Whether it was James Murray in Canada or the NGOs responding to famine and religious oppression in Tsarist and Bolshevik Russia, the common theme of Protestantism and progress appear to have been as strong in the government apparatus as well as with the general public. The difference within policy-making circles was that this Protestant progressive perception was tinged with an overlay of pragmatism, which placed peaceful coexistence at the heart of religious freedom and relegated the Protestant progressive perception to the sidelines, present, but not the pillar upon which religious freedom policy was built within the empire. This perhaps explains the similarities and differences between the implementation of policies relating to religious freedom over the passage time and the distance between Murray in Canada and the 1858 proclamation in Canada. The examples of British agents and officials seeking to prevent missionary activity in India, Arabia, and the Ottoman Empire between 1858 and the outbreak of World War II that I discussed in my 2018 paper all showed that the attempts to hinder, indeed prevent, Christian proselytizing whilst allowing Islamic dawah could all be traced back to the commitment made in the 1858 proclamation. But hopefully this paper has served to nuance that argument by demonstrating that the policy was the continuation of a strain of pragmatism in religious freedom policy making that could be traced back well beyond the particular circumstances of the 1858 proclamation, and that these policies did not alter the wider cultural perception that societal progress was intimately connected with Protestantism. So whilst the belief in the connection between Protestantism and progressivism remained, the public implementation of that belief in religious freedom policymaking was highly constrained by local conditions. Religious freedom in the pre-World War II British understanding could therefore be viewed to be a precursor to what has become social cohesion policy in the 21st century. Thank you.